Okay, the first thing I want to make very clear is that I'm not a psychic and I'm not a channeler. A lot of people get me mixed up with that because of my work with the Nostradamus prophecies. I'm a hypnotherapist. I've been doing hypnosis into past lives for 17 years. This is called past life therapy, past life regression, where you take the person into the other lifetimes to find the answers to problems in this lifetime. And it's a form of therapy that's becoming more and more popular. So this is the type of work I've been doing for 17 years. And along the way, I've found some very interesting stories where people have gone into lifetimes where they've been associated with famous people in history, or been in a time when something important was happening in history. And this is mostly what I've written my books about, have been these exciting stories that I have found through people's past lives. So I consider myself to be the reporter, the researcher. And I call myself the researcher for lost knowledge. I have to put all the information together and do the research into it and present it in the form of books. So I'm not a psychic and I'm not a channeler. I'm simply a reporter. That's what I consider myself. But with the Nostradamus material, that was totally different of an ordinary regression session. So it is part of my work as a hypnotherapist. They say it's the strangest case that's ever happened in the history of hypnosis. You can't call it channeling, you can't call it hypnosis because it is so different. It was actually going back through time and contacting Nostradamus while he was alive, living in the 15th century, 1500s in France. But it happened totally by accident about 10 years ago in 1986 when I was working with a woman who just wanted to go into a past life to see if she had a past life. There was no problem. She didn't want any therapy. But during the course of the regression, some very strange things began to happen. We didn't set out to contact Nostradamus. I don't think you could have. It was something that was totally unpredicted and simultaneous and spontaneous. But during the course of the session, she went back to a lifetime where she was a student of Nostradamus in France. And that's when everything got very strange, because as this male student, she was talking about Nostradamus, and suddenly she said, "He wants to speak to you." And I was totally, shocked, because anyone who does this kind of therapy knows that does not happen in this kind of therapy. And she said, "He has a message for you. He had been looking for a link to the future, because he could see that the prophecies where he had written were not being correctly interpreted, and the time was coming when they were going to come true. So he said he has an assignment for you. He wants you to get the book that has the prophecies in them, in French and English, and he wanted me to read them to him, and he would tell me what they meant and explain all of the code that has been lost for 400 years. He would explain every symbol, every anagram, and tell me what part of history. At that time, I didn't even know what a quatrain was. The quatrain is a 4-line poem. In the case of Nostradamus, a 4-line prophecy. And he wrote almost 1,000 of them. And not even half of them have ever been correctly interpreted. And some of them have been interpreted after the fact, after they've already occurred. So it was quite an assignment. But when the woman woke up and I told her what she had said, she was so frightened she moved to Alaska. So you can't say I started it, you can't say she started it. There was something very peculiar at work here that is still difficult to explain to people. But we had time for one more session before she left. I think she was trying to appease me more than anything, and it was helped with packing boxes and suitcases, and she was having a garage sale. And she said, "I have 1 hour to do the session," and then they were having a going away dinner for her. But during the session, he came through again, and he said, "I still want you to do this work." I said, "I can't. She's moving away." He said, "That doesn't matter. Now that we have made this connection, I will come through anybody you work with." And he gave me the instructions how to locate him and a test to perform so I would know I was actually speaking to him. And this is why it ended up with 3 volumes, because over the course of 3 years, it went through 12 different people. He did what he said. He would come through anybody I worked with. It was like having his telephone number, And I could call him up anytime I wanted, and I'm still able to do it if we want to get some more information. But we successfully translated all of the known prophecies, almost 1,000 of them, and I had the unenviable job of putting them in order, in a chronological order of some kind. It took a computer to do it. But the translations were coming so fast at the height of our work that as fast as I could read them to him, he was giving it back. We were doing 30 translations in an hour. It's absolutely impossible for the human mind to do that. It cannot think that fast. But he was telling me what all the symbols were, the anagrams, and he broke the code. Then I had to use a computer to put it together. So it ended up with 3 books because it took many twists and turns along the way. And none of the people I worked with knew anything about what the other ones had said. But yet they continued the same scenario, the same story he was trying to get across to our time. There was no deviation, no matter what prophecy I read. I found later it wouldn't have mattered if I would have started at the beginning of the book and read straight through, because they are in no set order. They're not in chronological order. I would just open it to anywhere in the book and check off after I'd read it. But at the height of this, they were just coming so fast, 30 in an hour. But there's another part to this that makes it even stranger, is he was most emphatic. He said, "You must understand you are not speaking to the dead. I'm not a spirit floating around out here somewhere." And he wanted me to be very sure that I emphasized that. He said, "You are speaking to me while I am alive, living in France, writing the prophecies." And you know what that brings up, if that's true? It's the metaphysical concept of simultaneous time, that there is no time, that everything is occurring all at once. Very strange and very difficult concept to but this is what he said. I am contacting him while he is alive. That's why I consider it having his telephone number. But I got to know him very well, and he is really a very definite personality, and there was no way we could mistake it when we had contacted him. Okay, because they all described his physical appearance as being the same. But his eyes especially were very penetrating and very strong eyes. But he had a definite temper. He would get very upset with me if I had not done the correct research. He would tell me exactly where to go in the libraries to find the information. And in breaking the code, a lot of it had to do with ancient Greek philosophy, Greek history, and Greek legends. Because he said this way he could fool the Inquisition by thinking he was commenting on history. And actually he was foretelling an event. But when I didn't quite understand what he meant, he kept saying, "I'm appalled at your lack of education, because we don't have to learn those things in our time period." But he would tell me where to go in the libraries to find them. If I did not do the research exactly, he would have this very stern temper. But it was as though you were with a very stern schoolmaster, I think would be the way you would classify it. As though you were a student with someone who had all this knowledge and trying to learn from them. But also, I found out that he was very definitely a male chauvinist. And I thought that was okay, because during the time periods he lived in, women were not educated. They were not taught anything. And he didn't have the same relations with women there that we would today. So I could understand that. But it was a very definite personality. The main reason was the Inquisition, because he was living during the time when the church was very powerful, and to do anything like this, he would have been condemned to death, or he said he would have taken his land away and thrown him into prison. So he had all these visions, and what is he going to do with them? At first he was writing them down in a kind of a diary, but he knew that if he died, they would be found and they would be burnt. So how was he supposed to protect the prophecies to get them to our time period for which they were intended? The only way was to devise this code. And anagrams were very popular in France during that time period. So he was using something he was familiar with. And he made these anagrams and puzzles. And there were, that's why he was almost 1,000 of them. He said there were actually about 1,500, but some of them have not survived to our time. But he had to do it to confuse the Inquisition. And it worked because they have come down to our time, even though they've been undecipherable in most cases. The main reason that he said he was making this contact was because he wanted us to help change the futures. He said a lot of people don't like Nostradamus because they say he's doom and gloom. Very horrible predictions. He said, if I show you the most horrible things man can do to himself, will you do something to stop us? The worst case scenarios of what would happen if nobody did anything at all. He saw time not as one future set in concrete, but as many branches, many probabilities and possibilities off of an event. So he was showing us the worst case scenario off of any of these paths that you continued on. So he believed that mankind could change the future, especially if you knew what that future was. So his job was to tell us, this is what's going to happen if you continue along this path. And he said that man doesn't know the power of his own mind. If you knew what was going to happen and focused on the opposite scenario, the opposite effect, that could be our future. We could create that with our minds. But he also said, if the power of one man's mind is that powerful, imagine the power of group mind. That if you get groups of people focusing on the opposite, on peace and harmony for the world, you could truly create miracles, because the power of the mind at that point would not only be multiplied, it would be squared. The power would be tremendous. And this is what my message has been as I travel all over the world, is tell people they can change the future. They are not puppets. They do not have to go along with what is predicted. We can have a wonderful future if we just know about it, focus on it, use our minds. We're so scattered. Our energy is very scattered. When you focus that energy, it can be tremendous. But the problem is that the predictions are coming true. But if we know we can make changes, maybe that's the point. Will we do it? Mankind does have free will. And he told us exactly where they went in history. And from his time to ours, there were hundreds that had dealt with the past as we consider the past. He said, don't worry about those, because they'll only be interesting to people who are interested in history. Focus on the next 20 years. And this was from the 80s when we were doing this. But in those, there was tremendous amount of things that have already come true. He even named Pasteur in one of the quatrains by name. And the famous Hister quatrains. There were many of those, but I even found out more quatrains dealing with Hitler besides just that one. He had all the phases of all the wars from his time to ours, and he had many, many inventions, which he called by the names of metal beasts and, fish, like submarines, like metal fish, because he didn't know what else to call them. He predicted air flight. He was very definite about a lot of these things. And he had many predicting the atomic bomb that have never been interpreted till now. One that I thought was interesting was where he talked about the stone in the tree. The stone being the bomb, and the tree, how we always think of the bomb as represented by a mushroom cloud. To him it looked like a tree. And in the quatrain he talked about the stone in the tree as the explosion of the atomic bomb. But not only did he talk about wars and inventions, he talked about every philosophical trend that man would go through. These are all very important to him. So there were many, many that have already occurred. And since I began working with him, and the books were first published in 1989, so it's on record before the Gulf War began, he gave us the dates for the beginning of the Gulf War 3 times. And he talked about Saddam Hussein in anagram form before the Gulf War ever started. And parts of this have not come true yet, so we know we're not finished with Saddam Hussein or the wars in the Middle East. But many of the events in the last few years have been documented before they occurred. We were given the The ones for the fall of the Berlin Wall, we had 3 quatrains that were explained to us before the fall of the Berlin Wall. It was very definite about the wall in the east will fall. And we were told about the breakup of the communist countries, that they would pull away from Russia, some peacefully and some violently, to where Russia would be reduced to the original size of Russia and Siberia. And all these things have come true since my work began with him. So there are many, many of these have come true. And as we're now going into the 4th printing of Volume 1, so much has happened that I've added an addendum, 50-page addendum to the back of the book of events that have just come true in the last year alone. And it's really amazing. And a lot of it has to do with computers, World Wide Web. These were very definitely predicted. He didn't call it World Wide Web, but he talked about the world being hooked together with wires all over the world dealing with computers. And a lot of these predictions are very frightening because they are coming true. And I thought maybe in 100 years, but now in less than 10 years, the things he saw about computers and experimental weaponry are happening in our lifetime. So it is now. It's right up to the minute. Nostradamus said, if we can just get through the decade of the 90s, we'll be okay. See, he saw this horrible war that he referred to as the Third World War. And there were many, many predictions dealing with the third Antichrist that he saw that would be the instigator of the Third World War. And he said, if you can just get through the 90s, he called this the time of troubles. Just get through this without going into this war. Keep it on the lesser scenario, the less violent scenario, will be fine. Because after the year 2000, we're going to be going into wonders you cannot even believe. But he saw the possibility of a terrible war that would be not only atomic, but biological weapons, chemical weapons, germ warfare, the most horrible things you can imagine, and he verified for us. And some of these things I thought, well, it sounds like science fiction. But he said, no, it's already invented, and your scientists are working on them. But I let that go until I began to get letters and phone calls from people saying, it's not fiction, I know because we're working on these things. So we're sitting right now at a very volatile time. We could go into this most horrible war, or we could stay like we are. But if we can get through the 90s, then we will go into the 1,000 years of peace after we're into the year 2000. Because he saw a figure coming along at that time that he called the great genius. Now, if the Antichrist is the epitome of evil, of everything that is terrible, he said this great genius would be the total opposite. Because he said the pendulum cannot swing all the way to the very evil man and stay there. It must swing back to balance. And when it does, it comes into the time of the great genius. And he will have such wondrous inventions. We will be living in space, traveling in space, having space colonies. The human body will be perfected to the point that it will never die, and will be in the 1,000 years of peace. So this is the time I like to focus on, rather than the terrible things he saw. He said he wanted us to know there was a wonderful future ahead of us. We can just get through the end of the 90s. He said there will be more things happening in the 90s, more significant events than have ever happened in the history of the world before. And I like to say it reminds you of the old Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. But he believed that we chose to live here at this time. Because he said by living now, you could work off as much karma in one lifetime as you would normally take 10 lifetimes to do. This is why we have so much happening all the time. So much coming at us from all directions. We're trying to work off a great deal of karma at this time. But he said you chose to be here. And it can really be very good for the people if they will stick with it and do it. But the great genius, that is part of what's going in the addendum. The internet has been very helpful with this because Nostradamus saw the next wave of computers. The first one was going to be would operate by voice, which they're working on now. The next ones would be by thought. And I've heard that this is being worked on. But during the time of the great genius, there would be an organic computer. and that it would be able to duplicate human parts, duplicate human bodies. And he saw the great genius as transferring his intellect into this computer so it would be there to guide us through the 1,000 years of peace. We'll also be running all the power that will power the world and the space stations. But on the internet I found out that they are working now on computers based on DNA. That they say they will be 1 million times faster and more accurate than anything we have now because of the way that the DNA transfers information. This is how they will be able to transfer information using the same thing. Because they have gone as small as they can go with chips. The next step is cellular. So they said everything is going to go down to the tiny, tiny level of cells. And this is all in the field called nanotechnology. Nano meaning very, very tiny. And it's amazing because we were given this information 10 years ago, and it's happening now. It's all coming about. That he said that the great genius would transfer his knowledge into this. They say this is very possible because all it is energy. And it'd be very possible within the next several decades anyway. It is an interesting question that what happens with all the people, because, well, we're going to be living on space stations. We're traveling in space. Probably a lot of us will want to go live on the moon or on Mars or something. But it might be at the point that maybe we won't be reproducing as fast as we are now. It's possible. Because of my work with the aliens and the UFO work, they don't die until they're ready to die. So there's no need for new beings to be born if they're going to stay on the earth longer. I don't know what would happen there, but I think there'd probably be ways of working this out, maybe going to other places. Like a new adventure is all opening up out there. Well, Nostradamus said that from the time he was a child, he always had visions. He thought everybody had these things. He was very amazed when they told him this was forbidden. But he could always see things from the time he was a child. And he knew about the cosmos. You know, in his day, they thought that the earth was the center of the universe, of the sun. Everything was rotating, around the earth. And he knew different, even before the times of Galileo. But he had to be careful what he said. But he'd been able to do this since he was a child, and he often wondered where it came from. And he knows that it came from God. It was a gift from God, because otherwise, he said, why would he been able to do it? I think he was a man out of his time. He was way ahead of his time, because the time of the Inquisition, he couldn't tell these things. But he did believe it came from God. He didn't know about being chosen. He thought of it more as a curse than anything else, because it did affect his life in many negative ways. Well, I think Nostradamus is recorded as being the most accurate there ever has been. Of course, Edgar Cayce falls in with that. He also went into trance. We found that Nostradamus would go into trance, and that's how he found these things. He would see the visions. And he said he would wake up, he would find that he had written the 4 lines with automatic writing. He said, I saw all these things, but yet I wrote 4 lines that referred to everything he had seen, which is about the same way that Edgar Cayce would do. He would go into trance and also have visions. There's probably been many others, but I think Nostradamus is the one that's the most famous. But I don't believe that, because we do have free will. And the idea is if we know what's going to happen, we can have control over it. I think it's the job of any psychic to try to warn people. Even a modern-day psychic, when they see something happen, they'll try to tell you, don't get on that train, or, don't take the car today if they see something happen. Otherwise, why have the vision if you don't try to help the people and warn them about it? So that was his primary purpose, was to let people know what was going to happen. Then, of course, if they ignore the warning, if they take the train anyway, or if they do get in the car, it's their own free will that has done that. Because we are a planet with free will, and we have to respect that. Because they said it would not be a test if you knew the answers. But still, when it comes to things of this magnitude, if you have warnings, you can do something about it. That's not really taking away from the lesson, because you still have the choice of which way you want to go. Most people think that at the year 2000 this is going to be the end, or if we have it in this war, or even if we go into the Earth shift, the shifting of the continents, they think that is the end of the world. But it's not. Mankind is a survivor. He will continue to go on. Even if there are many lost, there will always be some around that will survive. Man is, he's here forever. So I asked him one time, well then, if this is not the end of the world, what is? And he said, many people have asked him, you could see so far in the future, how far can you see? He said, I can see to the end of the world, but not the end of time. He saw the world being destroyed when the sun went supernova. And when it would supernova, it would blast out all this heat, and the earth would be incinerated. But he said, you don't have to worry about it. That's so far in the future that when it does occur, there will be no people on earth. They will have long since gone somewhere else. So you don't have to worry about it, but he could see how it was going to end. So we're going to have many things between now and then. But man is a survivor. He will always be around. There's much information out here about what they're calling the Earth shift, or the shift of the axis. This is what would happen if all of the, say for instance, the polar ice caps would melt and all of the water would rush down. This would be caused very easily by an Earth shift. The Earth is sitting right now at an angle, a slightly off-center angle. And some of the people who have talked about Earth shifts say we'll do a complete flip-flop. We have no information about that. The only thing we have is that it would take a slight tilt. It wouldn't have to be very much. A slight tilt would be enough to begin the ice cap melting and to send the water rushing down out of Canada. But it's enough to do it that the tectonic plates will be forced against each other. They will be moving. Because when we did our maps, we thought, this is strange. Why are some of these areas being left when, according to the elevations and geology, they should not be left? They're not high enough. The mountain areas, you could see why they would be left. The other areas, why would they be left? Nostradamus explained that as the Earth takes that slight tilt, the tectonic plates will move. They will be forced against each other. So the center part of the United States would be forced upward as much as 2,000 feet, while the outsides would drop off, California and Florida. That's what happened on many of the continents, a forcing upward and then a dropping off because of the movements of the plates against each other. Now, many people have maps of what will occur, and I've done conferences with these different people, and mine are the worst. They show a lot less land left than any of the other maps. So I said, this doesn't mean that any of us is right or anyone is wrong. We all have pieces of information. Mine, again, seemed to be the worst case scenarios, as he was trying to show us the absolute worst would happen if you go to the extreme. If you will notice my map of the United States, there isn't very much left. The black areas are the areas that are left. The center part of the United States is the biggest section. That is the part that he said would be forced upward by 2,000 feet, while the other areas will be dropping off. California, most of what will be left will be the tops of the mountains as islands, a series of islands. And Texas and Florida, all those areas would drop. But the second map is dealing with Canada, and it's hardly any land left there because it's closest to the Arctic Circle. And as the water comes down, it floods all of those lakes. Those lakes come down and flood the Great Lakes, spread out the Mississippi and the Missouri rivers, so you can see how most of that area would be underwater. South America is the same thing, would be mostly the mountainous areas like the Andes that would be left, and the other areas where the Amazon River, that would go down. So this part of the hemisphere would be the mostly affected as the amount of land that would go underwater. This would occur because with the tectonic plates shifting, you would have terrible tidal waves, earthquakes of unknown proportions. The volcanoes would be going off all over the world. Terrible storms. They said there's nothing on earth that could prepare you for this. It would be something that's never happened in our memory. We could not be prepared for the violence of this when it occurs. The one of Africa, see, the same way, the Mediterranean would be completely overflowing into the top part of Africa, and the desert areas would be underwater. The Holy Land would be all underwater, and it would be broken up into pieces. Europe is most of that will not be under its effect. There will be some parts of England that will be affected, and as you can see, France and Spain as the Mediterranean moves up, and some of the Nordic areas because of the North Sea overflowing. But when I gave a lecture in Holland, and they looked at the map, they said, we don't need to look at that map to know we're going down. They said we were in a 3-story building, and they said this whole building would be underwater if that dike breaks out there. So they know that whole area is very vulnerable. It could all go down very easily. And there's a whole lot more to the part about Europe because he has many quatrains referring to England during this time, and that there would be so little land left that many of them would go to France to live. So there's a whole lot of prophecies dealing with the earth shifts. And the last one is the Asian continent, which will be the least affected. China a lot of it will disappear, but he said the Russian part of the Asian continent will have cracks, but it won't break up to the extent that the other areas would. Japan will have new land rising because of volcanic action, as will New Zealand and the Hawaiian Islands because of increased volcanic activity. But that is the least affected will be the Asian continent and the part of Russia. And of course, what continent don't I include in these? Australia. And when I'm in Australia, they always say, where are we? Can you figure out why I have not included Australia? It's not going to change.
Okay.
And of course, when I'm in Australia, they all stand up and cheer when I say that, you know. But he said Australia was a unique continent because there was nothing for it to push against. It would move, it would float. Of course, it's going to have storms, it's going to have tidal waves, it'll have earthquakes, but it won't break up like the other continents will. It will be able to move. And this gives it a very unique quality over all the rest of the continents of the world. But this is the information we got, and like I said, let's consider it the worst case scenario because the other maps that are coming out are much, much easier and a lot more land is left. A lot of people are thinking this is going to occur by the year 2000. We found there's going to be a lot of very important events occurring by the year 2000, but not the earth shift. It's way too soon for that. And other ones will argue with me about it, but I can only give you the information that we have. One of the quatrains was so complicated, we wrote a whole chapter on it. There was so much information in those small 4 lines. It was like peeling an onion. And I found the most important quatrains had the most information in them, were the hardest to decipher. And we had 3 astrologers working on that quatrain because it contained astrological dating. But they have all come up with a slightly different date. And this was dealing with the date of the Earth's shift. Now, one of them, they said it would be 2004. The other one said 2029. I prefer the later date. Let's get it as far away as possible. But that gives us plenty of time anyway. But he said by 2029, and I believe it was going to be in October. The dates are in the books. We have the horoscopes for the dating that they came up with. But it's done like a detective story. All the clues are there. And another astrologer may come up with something totally different than what we found. But this is all part of it, the deciphering of the mysteries of the quatrains. The problem was it's never been translated until now because they mistranslated it from the French. One of the most important clues was that they translated water for Aquarius. And an astrologer will tell you that Aquarius is a water bearer, and it has the glip of the wavy lines, but that is not a water sign. So it was never been able to be deciphered before because they were interpreting it as Aquarius. We had our astrologers go after a water sign. And when they searched for a water sign, because the whole quatrain was full of other astrological signs, they couldn't get that one to match. When we looked for a water sign, they were able to come up with the dates. So it's the first time it's ever been translated. But he said it dealt with the dates for the Earth's shift. But as I said, someone else may do the same thing, follow the same clues, and come up with a different date. That's part of the mystery. But he said the things we're doing to our environment and to our whole world is speeding up the process that could lead to the Earth's shift. But some people have said it's going to be very sudden. Other ones say it could be a gradual process. It is already occurring. The Earth shift started several years ago. And right at this time, it's a gradual process. This is what's causing the increase in the earthquakes and the increase in the volcanic eruptions. He said first the earthquakes would appear where they've always appeared, then they would appear where they've never appeared before. And you would have the volcanoes that have been dormant for hundreds of years will be reawakening. You have the changes in the weather and the changes in the climate. All of this is happening now. This is a gradual process. As long as it's happening gradually, we can handle it, even though there are disasters involved. It's that sudden shift is what we don't think we can handle. And part of this relates to what we're doing to the environment. And he also said you have to stop the underground nuclear testing because that's reverberating through the plates, it's speeding everything up. So it can be looked at both ways. It could either happen gradually or it can happen quickly, depending on what mankind does to the world. So we are here again in a position of deciding what we do with our world. Nostradamus saw in his future 3 men that he called antichrists. One was Napoleon, the second one was Hitler, and the third one is the one that is to come, who is said to be the worst of all because he will learn from the mistakes of the others. A very dangerous person. He didn't like the term antichrist. He said it was a Christian term and it was not exactly what he meant. But he said if you think of Christ as representing people, humanity, then Antichrist is someone who does terrible things against humanity, against people. And it can be the type of personality like Genghis Khan or Attila the Hun, the type that doesn't care anything about what it's doing, it only wants power. So this is what he meant by an Antichrist. But the third one, he gave us a great deal of information about him because he wanted us to do something to stop the man. He said, in the Bible, in the book of Revelation, and other books in the Old Testament, the people saw the same things that he saw, the prophets did. They only put them in their symbolism they could understand in their time, but they all saw the same thing. And that the man he refers to as the Antichrist is the number 666 in the book of Revelation, called the beast. Of course, he said 666 also refers to his connection to his computers. So there's a lot more to it. But he has been predicted as far back as Bible times. So he said he has a destiny to fulfill. He has to come, but after he comes, what happens after that is in the hands of mankind. Do we allow it to go through the worst case scenarios, or can we lessen it? That's the point. But the man is alive now, and he has his destiny to fulfill. We were given a lot of information about this man because he is so important. We have his horoscope. He was born on February the 4th, 1962, in Jerusalem, but he's not Jewish. And his parents were killed during the Israeli war, and when he was about 6 or 7 years old, and he was raised by his uncle. His uncle is a very evil man, and we have had many people see him, and we have, in my work, and we had one woman who was able to put together a police composite picture of the uncle and of the Antichrist. She was a psychic who has worked with police on many cases, so she knew how to do the police composite kits. But the uncle took the young boy and was raising him as his own. What the young boy doesn't know was that the uncle had his parents killed, so he could have him for his own. And he has gotten together a very powerful group of rich Arabs in the Middle East, and they've been taking care of this young boy and grooming him for the role he is to take. It's a very powerful group of people that control everything that happens in the Middle East. They're the puppet masters behind the scenes. Nostradamus said, by the time 7 puppets arise in the Middle East, you will realize what is happening, that they are not the real leaders of the countries, but they are the puppets being manipulated by the puppet masters behind the scenes. The young Antichrist went to college in Egypt, and we were working on this at the same time he was in college, so we were shown several scenes of him in college. We knew where he was living. We had all this information. His main courses that he took were economics, philosophy, and computers. The computers were going to be very important in his future that he was planning. But after he got out of college, he lives on the different estates of these very rich people. He has no home of his own, but travels around to the different estates. And we saw him once in a big estate on the banks of the Nile, and another one in Syria, and in Oman during the Gulf War. Oman is to the bottom of Saudi Arabia. So we saw him in all of these places during the Gulf War, and he's traveled around from place to place. But Nostradamus said, you must remember that in the beginning, this man will appear as a savior, the man with all the answers, the man with the golden tongue. And this will how he will make his conquests in the beginning. But he said, you must remember he's not what he appears to be. He's the wolf in sheep's clothing. Because by the time people realize what is happening, then everything will all come out. We were told in 1995, if you were watching, you become aware of these people and what they are doing. And of course I get lots of mail from people trying to tell me who they think the Antichrist is. But a lot of the people they have told me about, I think, are members of the group. They're very rich, but I don't think they are the Antichrist because they don't fit all of the other criteria. I think we are on the way because everywhere I go all over the world, people are taking this message and they're saying they want to do this. They want to go back to their different groups and tell people you can make a difference. It can happen. And even during the Gulf War, it only lasted a month because of all the protests people had about it even before it started. So maybe we can change the future. Maybe that was why it only lasted a month. Maybe it's why it didn't go on further. And maybe we can keep it from reoccurring because he sees going to be a succession of wars in the Middle East. We're not finished there yet. And he saw that we would go to war in the gray area of Europe, which he called the gray area because he said you don't know if you're in Europe or if you're in Asia. And he used the terms Macedonia and Albania. He had no term for Yugoslavia. But this was the gray area. And he said by 1995 you will make the decision if you're going to go to war or not. Well, we sent our troops into Bosnia during that year. So we are going along with the scenario. But I'm hoping by just changing one little thing, we can change the worst that he saw. It's like everything. One little event can make a big difference. Because he said if you look back on World War I and World War II, you will see all these little things that preceded it. But at the time, you were not aware of where it was leading. And at the present time, that's what's happening. The Gulf War was the beginning of the Third World War. In the future, we'll look back on that and see that was where it started and escalated from there. But we can hope that it won't do that, that maybe we'll be able to stop it, keep it in a lower key. I would like nothing better than to have all these prophecies not happen. We could go directly into the time of the great genius and the 1,000 years of peace. That's what I hope. But I'm just a reporter, and I deliver the message of the material that I've received. Like they always say, don't kill the messenger. I'm just reporting what I've got, and I think it's important that the world knows that they are sitting in a volatile time when we can make a great difference by our actions.